Hello everyone. For this week's tutorial, I'd like to discuss the tone-based effects, also known as the timbre-based effects. Hello everyone. For this week's tutorial, I'd like to discuss the tone-based effects, also known as the timbre-based effects. Similar to last week's tutorial, I will comprehensively go over all of them, although the list of tone-based effects is much shorter than the list of time-based effects. However, the trade-off is that tone-based effects are much more complicated to operate than the time-based effects, even reverb. The most simplest of the tone-based effects is distortion, which you can achieve manually by producing a loud enough sound to overdrive the circuit and the amplifier, such as yelling into the microphone at the top of your lungs. But it is generally a wiser idea to use the distortion studio effect as opposed to using the distortion that comes with your mic, because the studio effect gives you a wider range of tones than your mic can support. As usual, make your recording. Then click Effect, then Distortion. And a pop-up menu will appear with Distortion Type, DC Blocking Filter checkbox to the right of that, and then two slider parameters below that control the threshold of the distortion, and three sliders beneath that control various parameters of the distortion effect tone. The first type is called hard clipping, and allows you to change the clipping level, drive, and makeup gain, where the clipping level refers to the maximum volume that the sound can have before it gets clipped. So the lower the clipping level, the more pronounced the clipping is, as it has more sensitivity. The default clipping is -6 decibels. As usual, make your recording. Well, if you make it all the way down to its minimum value, -100 decibels, it'll sound like this. As usual, make your recording. And if you turn it all the way up to 0 decibels, it'll sound like this. As usual, make your recording. Notice how it's so subtle that you don't even notice it. Whereas the clipping level determines how sensitive the threshold is before it begins. The drive determines how severe the clipping is once it does begin. Here's an example with a default clipping level of -6 decibels and 100% drive. As usual, make your recording. Here's an example with 1% drive. As usual, make your recording. The final parameter, makeup gain, refers to how strongly the original recording is amplified after the distortion. The default is 50%, like drive. If you turn up to 100%, this is what happens. As usual, make your recording. If you turn it down to 0%, this is what happens. As usual, make your recording. The next type of clipping is soft clipping, which has all the same options slider-wise as hard clipping. But the difference is that, instead of clipping the sound entirely at the threshold, it will instead try to approximate the sound that has been clipped off. So at the same threshold level, it will sound less severe than hard clipping. Like this. As usual, make your recording. The other difference is that drive is called hardness, but it does the same thing as in hard clipping. The next type is called soft overdrive, but sadly, This does not allow you to change the threshold. It is built into the effect. Although it does allow you to determine the distortion amount and the gain after distortion, which is called output level here. The difference between overdrive and distortion is that overdrive amplifies or drives the signal to the point where it might get clipped, whereas distortion distorts the signal no matter what the original volume level was. As you may be able to guess by its name, soft overdrive is the least hard of the overdrive options, and sounds like this. As usual, make your recording. Medium overdrive is more pronounced and sounds like this. As usual, make your recording. And hard overdrive is the most extreme and sounds like this. As usual, make your recording. The next type of distortion after the overdrives is called cubic curve, and in parentheses odd harmonics. And it is called a cubic curve exactly because it emphasizes the odd harmonics of the sound, which is a fancy way of saying the odd numbered frequencies that make up the sound. Like the overdrive options, there is no threshold control as it is done by the algorithm. But there is a distortion amount, a makeup gain called output level, and this time a third parameter called repeating process, which simply determines how many times the effect is applied. As you can imagine, the more times the effect is applied, the more pronounced it will sound. Here's an example with maximum distortion and repeat only one time. As usual, make your recording. Here's an example with repeat the maximum times 5 and maximum distortion. As usual, make your recording. The next option is called even harmonics, which, like odd harmonics, does not allow you to determine the threshold and has a distortion percentage from 0 to 100. But unlike odd harmonics, it has harmonic brightness where the gain should be, which refers to how pronounced the harmonics will be in the sound, and also allows you to click on DC blocking filter, which refers to any sound that is an even, flat sound, like a power line hum, or the sound that heart monitors make when your heart stops beating. Here's an example with minimum harmonic brightness and maximum distortion. As usual, like a recording. Here's an example with maximum harmonic brightness and distortion. As usual, like a recording. Here's an example with DC blocking filter checked. As usual, like a recording. Note that since we didn't have any flat sounds in here, it didn't do anything, as expected. The next effect, expand and compress, applies two different types of distortion to the upper and lower parts, whereas the distortion types leading up to now applied the same distortion throughout the entire sound. In particular, the algorithm clips the top parts of the sound around here and applies something called crossover distortion to the bottom parts of the sound, which has a sort of uneven sound and comes from the field of electronic hardware, where the signal lags when it travels between two transistors, aka crosses over between them. Here is what expand and compress sounds like at maximum distortion and maximum output level. Here's what it sounds like at minimum distortion level but still a maximum gain.
As usual, make your recording.
The next effect, leveler, works similar to the compression algorithm discussed when I talked about MP3 and OGG Vorbis files. And this one does allow you to control the threshold, where the threshold is called noise floor and is limited between -80 and -20 decibels before compressing. And the two parameters are leveling fine adjustment and degree of leveling, which is a sort of coarse adjustment, aka does much bigger steps than the fine adjustment. As you can imagine, the lower the noise floor and the greater the degree of leveling, the more pronounced the effect will be. Like this.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice how there wasn't much difference between the loudest and quietest parts in the sound. Which is why the effect is called the leveler, because it levels out the sound. The next type of effect is called rectifier distortion, and is given that name because it simulates the electronic signal processing from rectifier diodes, which gives you a tone very similar but not identical to odd harmonics. Here's what it sounds like at maximum distortion percentage.
As usual, make your recording.
There is also a DC blocking filter checkbox available, like with even harmonics. The last type of distortion is hard limiter 1413, and works similar to leveler in that it levels out the sound. But it has different parameters, in particular decibel limit, which works like the threshold or noise floor of the original leveler. Wet level, determining how strong the amplification is. And residual level, doing the opposite of wet level, i.e. softening the effect. So that way, it can be used to fine-tune the limiting. Here's what it sounds like with 100% wet level and residual level.
As usual, make your recording.
Here's what happens if I change the residual level to 0. And here is what happens if I change the wet level to 0.
As usual, make your recording.
Now that I've gone over all the distortion types, we can move on to phasers, which are provided by clicking Effect, then Phaser. And you will see that this option has no drop-down menu. It is made of all sliders. In particular, the sliders are number of stages, dry to wet signal ratio, LFO frequency, LFO start phase, depth, feedback percentage, and output gain. Where stages refers to how many phases are in the signal, which in turn makes the sound more complicated the more stages there are. Here's what the sound sounds like at the maximum number of stages, 24.
As usual, make your recording.
And here's what it sounds like at the minimum, too.
As usual, make your recording.
The dry to wet ratio determines how pronounced the dry signal, i.e. the original recording before the phaser is applied, is versus the wet signal. By default, it is in the center, so that the dry and wet signals are pronounced equally. But if you turn it all the way down, it will sound like this.
As usual, make your recording.
So that no phasing is applied. And if you turn it all the way up, like this.
As usual, make your recording.
Only phasing will be applied. The LFO frequency determines how many times per second the phasing is done. By default, it is 0.4 times per second, aka 0.4 Hz. But if you turn it all the way up to the maximum value, 4 Hz, it will sound like this.
As usual, make your recording.
The next slider, the start phase, is more subtle, and it determines the point along the LFO waveform that the LFO starts at, with the default being 0 degrees, so that it starts at the exact beginning. But you can also turn it all the way up to 360, which is also the beginning, and any degree in between to start at any point along the waveform. For example, 180 would be halfway through the waveform, and 90 would be a quarter way through the waveform, and so on. Here's what it sounds like with the default 0 degrees.
As usual, make your recording.
Here's what it sounds like at 70 degrees.
As usual, make your recording.
Note the slight change in time of the wobble of the phaser. The depth refers to how pronounced the phaser is, and works in a similar concept to the tremolo effect shown 2 videos ago. By default, the depth is in the center at 100, but at its maximum value 255, it sounds like this.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice how the wobble sounds more louder because it is more pronounced. And here's what it sounds like at 0.
As usual, make your recording.
Note that because it is 0 depth, aka 0 amplitude, it does not get applied, as you would expect. The feedback percentage, 0 by default, allows you to determine how much of the signal is fed back through the processor. So for example, at 100% feedback, it'll sound like this.
As usual, make your recording.
And at negative 100% feedback, it will sound like this.
As usual, make your recording.
As you can tell, having it at the extreme points would be very painful on the ears. So for a more pleasant or musical effect, you would make it closer to 0 for a more subtle effect.
As usual, make your recording.
The final parameter, output gain, is the most simplest, and simply refers to the amplification of the whole sound after the effect is applied, like the output gain slider and the distortion effect. By default, it is at negative 6 decibels. This is what it sounds like at the maximum 30 decibels.
As usual, make your recording.
And this is what it sounds like at the minimum negative 30 decibels.
As usual, make your recording.
The final tone-based effect is called wah-wah, and you click Effect and wah-wah to get it. And like phaser, it is all sliders, there is no drop-down menus. And also like phaser, the slider options do similar things between the two effects. Whereas the phaser is used to phase the sound in and out for a psychedelic effect, the wah-wah effect is used to sweep the frequencies of the sound, like this.
As usual, make your recording.
The LFO frequency, like phaser, determines how many times per second the effect is applied. By default, it is 1.5 Hz, but at the maximum 4 Hz, it sounds like this.
As usual, make your recording.
The LFO start phase determines the point along the waveform it starts at, just like the phasor. So this is what it sounds like when I change it from the default 0 to 70 degrees.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice the change in time of the sweeping. The depth refers to how pronounced the amplitude of the sweeping is. By default, it is at 70. But here's what it sounds like at 100%.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice the large difference between the quiet and loud parts. The resonance determines how pronounced the extreme high points in the sound are, aka the peaks. By default, it is at 2.5, but this is what it sounds like at 10, the maximum resonance.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice how it sounds very sharp because of how emphasized the peaks are. The wah frequency offset percentage determines the range of frequencies the wah-wah effect will sweep. By default, it is at 30, but this is what happens at the maximum percentage.
As usual, make your recording.
And this is what happens at the minimum percentage.
As usual, make your recording.
Notice how at 100, it was able to sweep all the frequencies of the sound, so you didn't hear anything. Whereas at the minimum, it was only able to sweep so many frequencies, so it was very obvious. The final option, like with distortion or phasors, is output gain, and is -6 decibels by default, also like distortion and phasors. But here's what it sounds like at the minimum gain.
As usual, make your recording.
Here's what it sounds like at the maximum gain.
As usual, make your recording.
Although it may seem strange that the effect is called a wah-wah, and not something like frequency sweep, it is because that when the wah-wah effect was first invented in the 1960s, electric guitars were very popular, and the effect would be applied to their vibrating strings to make the guitar sound like you were saying the word wah. And so, even when the effect became applied to other instruments, the name stuck. Now that I've shown you all of the timbre-based effects, I can move on to teaching the basic spectral effects next week, which are known as that because they are based on the frequencies of the human hearing spectrum, which ranges from the deep bass that comes from car speakers to the high tones of an opera singer or a violin.
Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to see other tutorial videos, and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.